Shangri-La was once a mythical land, a utopian paradise lost in the Himalayas. But recently, the real Shangri-La has been found in China. Its legendary landscape of sacred summits and fertile valleys has recently been inaugurated as the nation's first national park. In Shangri-La, 13 ethnic groups, 1/4 of all the cultures in China, live harmoniously, surrounded by sprawling Buddhist communities. And the world's biggest prayer wheel, Shangri-La is no longer a dream, but a mountain paradise made real inside the land of the dragon. In 1933, author James Hilton published his best-selling novel, Lost Horizon, in which British diplomats on a flight from India to China crash-landed somewhere in the Himalayan mountains. They were rescued and taken to an earthly paradise called Shangri-La, where people live in harmony with the land, surrounded by stunning mountain scenery. When the novel was turned into a major Hollywood movie, people started searching for the location of the real Shangri-La. In the book, Shangri-La was located in a hidden valley, sheltered by an immense mountain peak. Several possible locations in the Himalayas were suggested, but in 1997, the People's Government of Yunnan province announced that the inspiration for Shangri-La was the town of Zhongdian. The ancient town was chosen after a careful investigation by the Yunnan Economic and Technology Research Center. As in Hilton's novel, Zhongdian sits in a valley crisscrossed with 3 rivers. The researchers even discovered that an American transport plane once crashed in Zhongdian. The evidence convinced the Chinese government, and in 2002, Zhongdian and the surrounding county were officially renamed Shangri-La. After James Hilton's novel was published, a new word became part of the English language: Shangri-La, meaning utopia on Earth. Scholars believe Hilton's Shangri-La was derived from a Tibetan word referring to a mythical paradise inhabited by both gods and humans, where man and nature coexist in harmony. Just as in the novel, the streets of the real Shangri-La also contain a mosaic of different cultures. The crooked cobblestone streets are home to 13 different ethnic groups, with Tibetans comprising the majority of the population. Many of the ethnic nationalities preserve their own unique traditions of lifestyle, dress, and architecture. But just as in the fictional Shangri-La, everyone lives in peaceful harmony. But Shangri-La is also a place of prayer and worship. streets are decorated with prayer flags and other symbols of religious devotion, as the majority of the population are Buddhist. Shangri-La is home to one of the largest Buddhist monasteries in Yunnan province. Constructed in 1679, the monastery is covered in the auspicious symbols of Buddhism, representing knowledge, enlightenment, and protection. One of the most common animals featured on the walls is a deer sitting peacefully on the ground. The deer is a direct reference to the place the Buddha first taught, which just happened to be inside a deer park. Such was the Buddha's wondrous appearance and peaceful presence that even the animals came to listen. Today in Shangri-La, people make more noise when worshiping Buddha. The monastery's 800 red-robed monks chant prayers with musical accompaniment. The resonant beat of the drum acts like a metronome, helping the monks chant in time. By the early 20th century, it's estimated that a quarter of all Tibetan men were Buddhist monks. During the monastery's golden age, more than 3,000 monks lived and studied here, surrounded by colorful paintings and elaborate statues of Buddha. The monastery is full of treasures, silver censers and bronze statues accumulated over many dynasties. But the most precious material glistening in the light of butter oil lamps is gold. Gold is said to represent the power of the sun and is the most revered substance in Buddhism. The precious metal has been mined in the highlands of Tibet for nearly 800 years. The monastery's walls, sculptures, and frescoes are all coated in a fine layer of pure gold. The monastery is filled with small statues depicting people who have obtained spiritual awareness. But the biggest and brightest golden monument is outside. Shangri-La is home to the largest prayer wheel in the world. The giant rotating cylinder is 80 feet high and weighs more than 60 tons. Wrapped around the wheel's axle are hundreds of blessings written on paper. Spinning the enormous prayer wheel multiplies the blessings. Turning the wheel requires at least 10 people working in harmony. This spirit of cooperation is reflected by the carvings on the cylinder, which show all the minority groups of China working together as one. For more than 300 years, gleaming in the sunlight, the gilded roof of the monastery has been a beacon for pilgrims traveling to Shangri-La. Each year, thousands of people come here to pay their respects to the surrounding mountains in a centuries-old act of devotion. Shangri-La sits in the shadow of the highest mountain in the province, said to be the spiritual home of a warrior god who protects all Buddhist followers. Kawagebo is one of the most sacred peaks in Tibetan folklore. According to legend, Kawagebo was once a terrible monster, destroying everything in its path. But when defeated by a Tibetan hero, Kawagebo was humiliated and vowed to change his ways. To renounce his evil past, he gathered an army and went in search of an area in need of protection. He came to Shangri-La and assumed the form of a mountain. Today, Buddhist pilgrims circle the mountain on foot to seek purification and thereby ensure a more auspicious reincarnation. But once, people had another reason to visit Shangri-La. It was at the center of one of the most perilous trade routes in the world. High on the Tibetan plateau, an ancient Buddhist monastery dominates the town of Shangri-La. The monastery sprawls over 82 acres and is a classic example of traditional high-altitude Tibetan architecture. The flat roofs help conserve heat in the bitter winter and make it easier to remove fresh snow. The high walls slope inwards at an angle of 10 degrees to provide stability against frequent mountain earthquakes. The monastery may have been a place of peace, but it was built like a fortress. Constructed across the side of a mountain, whose shape was said to be reminiscent of a castle, the monastery makes the most of its intrinsically defensive position and commanding view. The temples and houses are surrounded by circular walls built of stone and rammed earth. The fortifications were used to protect the monastery and its treasures from bandits, invaders, and even rival monk armies. Shangri-La needed elaborate defenses because it sits in the middle of one of the most important commercial routes in and out of China. Just 60 years ago, when much of Asia still moved by foot or hoof, the main link between China and the Himalayas was one of the world's highest and most precipitous paths. Called the Tea-Horse Road, it traversed 2,500 miles from the Himalayan mountains to the jungles of southern China. its name suggests, the Tea Horse Road was once a central trade route for exchanging mountain horses for tropical tea. The beverage has been brewed by the people of Xishuangbanna on China's southernmost border for more than 2,000 years. Surrounded by mountains covered in lush tropical jungle, rows of tea plants thrive in the high rainfall and humidity. In 641, tea from southern China arrived in the Himalayas. It became an instant sensation, as it was a hot beverage in a cold climate, where sometimes the only other options were warm yak milk or melted snow. By the 13th century, millions of pounds of tea were being exchanged for 25,000 horses each year. China desperately needed the sturdy steeds to take into battle against Genghis Khan's fierce nomadic tribes. The only trail connecting Nepal and China was the Tea Horse Road. Caravans of mules and yaks took more than 3 months to travel from China's verdant valleys across the wind-stripped, snow-scoured Tibetan plateau. When China's need for horses began to wane in the 18th century, tea was traded for other goods, including wool, gold, and silver. Right in the middle of this tortuous trail, where travelers from the Himalayas met traders from southern China, was Shangri-La. The town became an ethnic melting pot, a huge diversity of cultures united by trade. But Shangri-La is also a natural paradise, situated in one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. Which is why in 2007, more than 700 square miles of Shangri-La became China's very first national park. The real-life Shangri-La sits on the highest plateau on the planet, which the locals call the roof of the world. About 4 times the size of Texas, the Tibetan Plateau is a vast wilderness of endless blue skies and spectacular mountain landscapes. In 2007, over 700 square miles of this rugged land became China's first national park, all thanks to some introduced fish. During the last ice age, mighty glaciers scoured the Tibetan Plateau. When the rivers of ice retreated, an alpine valley was filled by Shudu Lake, one of the biggest glacial erosion lakes in Shangri-La County. Generations of Tibetans grazed their herds on the fertile pastures, and more recently, tourists fished the waters of the lake. But 10 years ago, a private developer started breeding several kinds of exotic carp in the lake to attract more visitors, especially anglers. But the experiment backfired, and the introduced species started to wipe out the native fish in the lake. Recognizing the threat to the environment, the local government stepped in. Local officials toured the United States, visiting places like Yellowstone for inspiration and insight into how the world's best national parks were run. Their investigations paved the way for change. In 2007, Putachor National Park was formed. Since then, over $26 million have been invested in the park, making it a leader in wilderness preservation and a model for the new Chinese system of national parks. Putachor National Park is also part of a much bigger UNESCO World Heritage Site. More than 2 million acres of Tibetan wilderness, described as the most biologically diverse and least disturbed temperate region on Earth, form the Three Parallel Rivers World Heritage Site. High on the Tibetan Plateau, three of Asia's greatest rivers, the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Salween, run roughly parallel to one another, separated by high mountain ranges with peaks over 19,000 feet. The Three Parallel Rivers World Heritage Site is also at the collision point of tectonic plates, which creates an exceptional range of geological features. One of the most famous is found in Shangri-La County, nestled at the foot of the Golden Flower Mountain. A freshwater spring bubbling up through limestone rock has created a series of remarkable terraces. Covering 740 acres and spilling 160 feet down the hillside, the whitewater stone terraces are one of the largest freshwater tablelands in the world. As water from the spring, supersaturated with minerals, trickles over the lip of a terrace, tiny amounts of calcium carbonate precipitate out of the water. Over time, the accumulated minerals form terrace upon terrace of gleaming limestone rock. According to legend, these terraces are the birthplace of the land's first farmers. In the mountains, flat, fertile land is scarce. So when the ancestor of one of the local ethnic minorities, the Nashi, saw the semicircular platform stepping down the hillside, he was inspired. Soon, all his people were creating terraced fields in the hills to grow their crops. The region became known as the birthplace of the Nashi people. And a visit to the terraces is a rite of passage for every member of their culture. The Nashi call the terraces a field left by fairies because of their resemblance to the terraced fields cut into the contours of the surrounding hills. Each summer, the Nashi gather at the whitewater terraces to celebrate the founding of their farming lifestyle. But people couldn't have tamed the land without taming one of the most iconic species of the Tibetan Plateau. In China, the real-life Shangri-La sits high on the Tibetan Plateau, in a valley more than 10,000 feet above sea level. In the high-altitude meadows, the air is thin, and it's bitterly cold for 6 months of the year. In this remote, harsh land, the locals have adapted to their surroundings and developed unique farming techniques. Traditional domesticated animals, like cows and sheep, don't thrive in the thin and icy air. So the Tibetans domesticated an animal that can survive at 20,000 feet above sea level. The yak. Perfectly adapted to life on the Tibetan Plateau, a yak's blood cells hold 3 times the amount of oxygen as regular cattle, and their thick woolly coat keeps them warm in the depths of winter. People first domesticated yaks 4,500 years ago, when nomads roaming the Himalaya highlands developed one of the earliest animal husbandry cultures in human history. Their Tibetan descendants continue to herd using traditional techniques, because without the yak, people would never have survived in this remote and challenging land. Yaks can be ridden, carry goods, and plow the land. Their woolly coats can be turned into tents, clothes, and leather. Yak meat is eaten, and yak milk provides all the necessary fat content in the Tibetan diet. Even their dung is used to make fires. In this mountainous land, yaks are farmed vertically. Since yaks thrive in cool temperatures, every spring, herders move their animals to alpine pastures high in the mountains. The herders spend the summer living in rough wooden cabins, returning to the lower grasslands before the snows of winter. Domesticating the yak also established an entirely new breed of dog. The Tibetan Mastiff has been the constant companion of yak herders for thousands of years. The dogs may look affectionate, but they've been trained to confront predators like wolves and leopards. With the help of their faithful canine guardians and specialized farming techniques, now more than 12 million domesticated yaks can be found throughout the Tibetan Plateau. And most of them are milked to make the famous Tibetan yak butter. Containing twice as much protein and minerals as cow's milk, yak milk is rich and nutritious, but it spoils in 2 hours. which is why it's usually made into butter. Yak butter is eaten with almost everything and mixed with tea and barley gruel to make a drink. Yak butter is also used in lamps, as a hairstyling product, and for greasing squeaky prayer wheels. The best butter comes from the offspring of a yak and a cow, called a zoe. Identifiable by its black and white coat, evidence of its mixed genes, the zoe is larger and stronger than either of its parents. Thanks to hybrid vigor, the zoe is the super beast of burden in Shangri-La. Yaks and zoes have become synonymous with wealth. The higher the number, the bigger and better off the household. Yaks even hold a special place in Tibetan mythology. The yak is portrayed as a protective god, looking after the people of the land. Ancient nomads once placed yak skulls at monastery gates to deter evil spirits. According to an age-old Tibetan song, a mighty mythical yak was even the origin of everything on earth. Its head became the sun, the intestines formed the rivers, and the yak's heart became the mountains. Thanks to the versatile yak, herders have lived high on the Tibetan plateau for thousands of years. But even Tibetans cannot live on yak alone. And at this altitude, growing crops isn't easy. The mythical Shangri-La was described as a paradise on earth. But in China, turning this high-altitude valley into paradise requires seriously hard labor. In his novel, Lost Horizon, James Hilton wrote of a mythical utopia high in the Himalayas, where people live in harmony with the land. In China, the myth has become reality in the land called Shangri-La. People have been sustainably farming these high-altitude valleys for thousands of years. High on the Tibetan plateau, the growing season is limited, lasting just 6 short months. Shangri-La is home to 13 ethnic cultures, and each has developed farming practices that have turned this harsh land into a productive paradise. Each culture cultivates different plants that have adapted to their region's unique microclimate. In the foothills of the mountains southeast of Shangri-La, the Nashi people have been growing a crop that was once only found in South America. Hanging on high wooden racks to dry is maize. Historians are mystified how this native of South America ended up in the mountains of Shangri-La. Some speculate it was carried here by merchants traveling the tea and horse trade route. But despite its mysterious origins, for centuries, maize has been essential for the survival of the Nashi people. Dried maize preserves well and can be stored for the long, cold months of winter. It can be ground into a coarse flour, fermented into maize liquor, and most importantly, used to feed livestock. But maize grows best on the steep terraces of the misty foothills of Shangri-La. People living higher in the mountains of the Tibetan Plateau grow a very different crop. In this village, there is no shortage of arable land, as it sits in the middle of gentle rolling alpine pastures. Here, the staple crop is highland barley, and it's as essential to daily life as the ubiquitous Tibetan yak. Barley looks similar to wheat, but it's the only grain that grows well in the extreme conditions of the Tibetan Plateau. Once harvested, barley is hung on high wooden frames to dry. In James Hilton's novel, the fictional Shangri-La was a paradise on Earth. But here, in this remote region of China, the locals have to work hard to survive. Most things are done by hand, not machines. In this Tibetan village, it's the job of the women to climb up and collect the sun-dried plants. So the process of collecting the grain can begin. Over countless generations, the Tibetans of Shangri-La have developed 28 different types of barley, each with a specific use and taste. Hitting the clumps of barley loosens the seeds prior to threshing, when the grains are separated from the stalks. In this harsh land, nothing goes to waste. The stalks are set aside for their domesticated animals. There are over 42 million head of livestock in the Yunnan province. And many of the animals are fed some of the thousands of pounds of highland barley grown each year. After threshing, the heavier barley grains are separated from the lighter chaff in a process known as winnowing. It's a process as ancient as the people of the land. But these women have incorporated modern technology and use motorized fans to separate the chaff. Elsewhere in Shangri-La, another ethnic minority, the Yi, harness the power of the wind. The Yi use the wind blowing up from the valleys to separate wild oats from the chaff. The 13 ethnic groups in Shangri-La have found different ways to survive in their highland homes. They also speak different languages and worship different gods. Yet somehow in Shangri-La, the various peoples have found ways to live in harmony for centuries. On a clear night, the white walls of the ancient town of Shangri-La reflect a silver sheen, which is why it's also known as the City of Moonlight. When the town was established, craftsmen found white clay in the region that could be ground down and used as paint. Soon, all dwellings were painted white, as Tibetans regard the color as a sign of respect for their forefathers. But Shangri-La was home to more than just Tibetans. Shangri-La, situated at the middle of the ancient tea and horse road trade route, became a melting pot of ethnic minorities from regions all over China. Today, 13 ethnic groups account for 1/3 of the total population of the province. Just as in James Hilton's mythical paradise, in Shangri-La, all people live in harmony. The town's ethnic diversity has led to a varied and complex order of religious beliefs, which coexist happily in the streets of Shangri-La. There are 4 distinct religions in Shangri-La: Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, and Christianity. In Shangri-La, Buddhism is prevalent. However, some people may believe in several religions simultaneously, while others share only one common belief. Shangri-La is a true multi-faith community and has been for generations. But all the different ethnic minorities in Shangri-La do have something in common. Just as the plants and animals of the Tibetan Plateau have adapted to live in the thin mountain air, the people of the land have become immune to altitude sickness. After generations of living high in the mountains, changes to a single gene have resulted in blood cells that are adapted to the very low levels of oxygen found in the air 11,000 feet above sea level. The different cultures of Shangri-La also share a love of dance, and every night they congregate in the squared floor of the town square. Locals and visitors alike take part in a traditional Shangri-La celebration that encapsulates the spirit of this utopian paradise. As night falls, the Guozhuang begins. Guozhuang literally means singing and dancing in a circle. The dance incorporates movements from the daily life of all the ethnic minorities in Shangri-La. Gathering barley, feeding cattle, and making butter. Traditionally, the Gushuang marks significant events in the life of the people. Performed at weddings, the lively dancing continues long into the night. But here in Shangri-La, the dance is a celebration of life. The circle is a joyous reminder of the unity and harmony that exists between all people in Shangri-La. This really is paradise, hidden high in the mountains of the land of the dragon.